pragmatic center.
So Rod, this is your second PDF. Welcome back.
Thank you. A treat.
And Darrell, thank you very much for joining us.
I'm Jason Chaffetz's substitute this year.
Well, so just on a little bit of brevity, but maybe quickly segueing into something serious. I always used to joke, in fact, I still do sometimes, that politicians don't know the difference between a server and a waiter. And I'm very happy to say that we have two members of Congress who definitely know the difference. So here's my first question. Why is it that so many members of Congress seem to not understand the internet or how powerful technology can be in our economy or our democracy?
My general take, Andrew, is we probably don't use our children enough as advisors. And I mean, seriously, I think we all understand there's a generational divide on this issue. It wasn't very long ago when you'd go to a hearing in the United States Senate and people were talking about the internet as a series of tubes. That is no longer. And to me, what we saw just a few months ago was a big triumph that will change the way policy is made forever. In effect, what you saw was citizen-driven networks beating the middlemen. And that is going to change American politics for all time.
Yeah. I think it's just that geeks have better things to do. The fact is the pathway to Congress or other elected office usually doesn't lead through tech activities. If you look at the real number of people that come out of the sciences, et cetera, in Congress, it's pretty limited. More than half of the Senate are lawyers. Slightly less than half of the House are lawyers. We have more doctors than we have people who have ever started a business in both houses. That's the nature of it. So that's half of our problem, and then I think Ron said it very well. There's a generational problem. A lot of times people have just simply gotten in the habit of not wanting to know how things work because they're doing other things, so they tend to say, well, I've got an IT guy that does it, and I have no idea how it works. And then they make these terrible jokes that show they really don't know how it works.
So it's not okay not to know how the internet works, but we just saw a disaster almost happen. So from your perspective, what happened on SOPA and PIPA? What that, deconstruct it for us a little bit.
Well, Andrew, to me, the middlemen got beat. What people have to understand is Washington is really all about middlemen. You've got pollsters, you've got media people, even television networks. What's striking, from the time that I put a hold, a block on the predecessor of PIPA and SOPA in 2010, there was virtually no television coverage, virtually none, until essentially a week or two before that vote in early January. And so what you had is essentially all across the country, you saw citizens through groups like PDF and Tumblr and Reddit, you saw citizens say, look, this is going to turn websites into web cops. This is going to roll back internet freedom and do permanent damage to what has been this great equalizer. It gives everybody a chance to get ahead, entrepreneurs, citizens to be heard. And there was a vote scheduled on January 24th at 2:15 in the United States Senate to take my hold off PIPA. If we had lost that, I think we would have had SOPA and PIPA. All of the people in this room, all of the people who are part of their networks deserve the credit. And one of the reasons Darrell and I wanted to come today is to say thank you for what you did January 18th, 15 million of you, to make sure that the internet stayed free and open for all time. Thank you to all of you.
So Darrell,
and following up on Ron, the fact is, you only have to look a few years back in history. In the late 90s, Congress, with not a lot of fanfare, realizing that Disney's, Mickey Mouse was actually going off copyright, that you were going to be able to own this thing that for 50 years had been out there, they just quietly and retroactively increased the copyright laws so that for the next 10 more years beyond today, more than 20-year extension, you're not going to be able to have rights to the original copyrighted material that, quote, created black and white Walt Disney characters. Of course, that was worth hundreds of millions or perhaps $1 billion to that, but billions of dollars to the industry. The industry was used to asking for things and getting it. And you understand, if you read the Constitution, you go, well, copyrights are there, patents are there, yes, and for a limited amount of time. And it doesn't say for a limited amount of time as corporate interest in Hollywood might need, but that's what has been happening. So if you're Senator Dodd, bless his heart, years in the Senate, you were in the Senate when that happened, you go over and say, well, this should be easy. All we're really doing is protecting those things that we hold so valuable. There hadn't been a balance of, but the Constitution envisions that after that limited period of time, you own it. And if it's not copyrighted and it's not patented, you already own it. That balance is something that the open internet has to claim, which is if it isn't protected, we own it. If it's fair use, we own it. And there has to be a pushback, or one side of the equation will simply continue to change the rules to benefit them.
But wouldn't you agree that the incumbent interests, the copyright industry, as a catch-all, use their currency of money and politics and their relationships they built up over decades, as you just described, to sort of run the table?
Oh, absolutely.
And so the question is did the network response create a new currency? And how, and since those incumbent interests are still very well supplied, how can this community, the network community, continue to protect the internet when they're so outgunned by, one, lack of understanding of the technology and its potential, and two, the financial backing of the opposition?
Well, people observe the stock market going up slowly, typically. But it goes up because of greed. It goes up because, in fact, people are investing. They think it's going to go up, so they invest. But it never goes up as fast as it goes down. Why does it go down? Fear. The fact is that greed, if you will, years of political contribution, years of going over to look at free movies over at the Motion Picture Association, those relationships that were built up, that was an assumption that there were good things that happened if you went with what they wanted. The internet community created a fear that the voters would realize that you were not looking at their interest as much as you were looking at one side's interest. So how do we repeat it? Make sure that that machine is always available when needed, and that people understand, because it is periodically exercised on issues, so they understand that people are watching. Because I believe that fear of being exposed as not caring about your 700 and some thousand voters as a congressman or a whole state as a senator is very powerful, and no member wants to be thought of as, quote, not caring about his constituency.
Andrew, my sense is that every single elected official now, when you put a microphone in front of them, is going to say, I am for an open and free internet. At the same time, they will sign on to a bunch of these bills, whether it's CISPA, or they'll support ACTA, or they'll support TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where Darrell is at least trying to get the word out to people about the threat in there. If this TPP is written badly, what could happen is all the wins that the people in this room have put together for internet freedom over the last few years, the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the wins we've won here in the United States could be unraveled as part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So you have these politicians who say that they're for an open and free internet, and they sign on to all of these bills. We're seeing it now with cybersecurity. I mean, under the guise of dealing with what is a legitimate threat, we've got this overreaction that could create a cyber-industrial complex if we're not careful. And I think, to follow up on Darrell's point, what we need is a way to measure how we're going to ensure that the voice of networks is protected. And what I hope will happen out of this meeting is that we will start a grassroots drive, really a netroots drive, to create a digital Bill of Rights for this country. A digital Bill of Rights where, in effect, much like our original Bill of Rights, which was for religious assembly and the right to petition, let's make sure that the country sees that we're not saying we have all the answers. Darrell and I, for our alternative to PIPA and SOPA, we crowdsourced that. We didn't say we're going to sit in Washington, D.C. and dictate. You've got to do A, B, and C as the alternative to PIPA and SOPA. We went to the grassroots, and I think we ought to do pretty much the same thing in terms of a digital Bill of Rights, and that would be a way to, as you point out, actually measure and check these various kinds of proposals to make sure the internet stays free.
Well, and as Ron said, we can draft anything, but the question is, will we go to the masses and say, are there better ideas, knowing that there must be. There'll be some worse ideas too, but there'll be better ideas. In the case of the Open Act, we put it up on keepthewebopen.com. Using the Madison format, people were able to come in, offer modifications. Many of them went into the bill that currently is being considered in the House, and of course the counterpart in the Senate. In the case of the Digital Citizens Bill of Rights, it's up on the Madison, up on keepthewebopen.com. Those 10 items are a draft. Those are just starting points of what we hope both parties will accept, that members of Congress will say, I hate to use paper here, but I support the Digital Bill of Rights. Whatever they are, we know probably there will be 10, and we know that they have to reflect the balance of what are our freedoms, knowing that obviously you can't be completely free.
We have a little bit of time, so read the ones you've got written down there.
Well, one of them, the first one is freedom. Digital citizens have a right to a free, uncensored internet. And that's probably the most important one, is can we at least communicate without having our thoughts interrupted? Openness. Digital citizens have the right to an open, unobstructed internet. Certainly SOPA and PIPA, we saw that likely obstruction. Equality. All digital citizens are created equal on the internet. Again, the whole question of get so-called net neutrality right, which today is being regulated by an agency that doesn't necessarily have guidelines given to it. Here's one that I'm particularly enthused about, 6. Sharing. Digital citizens have a right to freely share their ideas, lawful discoveries, and opinions on the internet. And that includes, obviously, the material that you reference when you're communicating, which goes into the whole question of fair use has not been well defined, because in the old days you say, well, I've got a book, I'll hand you the book. Well, now we may be talking a vast amount of copyrighted material, but if you and I are collaborating back and forth, I'm going to need to reference that, and that becomes fair use. So these kinds of ideas, and like I say, this is for others to go on to keepthewebopen.com and look at our effort for open government. And there's several people here from the foundation. We formed a foundation so that what started off as a congressional activity run out of my committee office is moving to a nonprofit, so that it'll have its own board of governors, so that it not be Ron or my impetus. And also, after he and I are out of office, we want to make sure that this goes on the way so many other nonprofits have been critical to the development of the internet. If not for a few open source minded people, a lot of what we do today we wouldn't be able to do. We'd be looking at specific vendors and their closed formats.
So in a previous time I would have said let the history book show, but I'm going to say let Wikipedia show that the Internet Bill of Rights got asked for and declared at Personal Democracy Forum 2012.
And if you type OpenGov, you'll go to keepthewebopen.com and you'll be able to read it and add your thoughts to what the final version should be.
It's part, Andrew, it's part of this vision that Darrell and I are trying to articulate of changing power in Washington, D.C. That's why I come back to this proposition that Washington, D.C. has always been run by middlemen. These middlemen tell everybody in the Congress what to think, they poll everybody, then they tell you what to say. Well, Darrell and I can go to our tweet deck. I mean, we got an alternative way of listening. And so the point of a digital Bill of Rights is not to have a bunch of people in Washington, D.C. in blue suits and red ties sit around and pretend that we know everything about how to shape digital policy. The more I learn about the net, frankly, the less I know. But what I do know is to go to people and listen, get a sense of how we empower them. That's why I look at this, and it's almost like today you're starting what amounts to a digital constitutional convention of bringing groups together and saying, let's help shape this.
Okay, so let's assume it starts to be iterated on by the community and people start, debating some of the language. SOPA and PIPA were a direct assault on the internet. It's very clear and present danger. Here in New York, the New York Tech Meetup put 3,000 people on the street from one email and one tweet because everyone understood what was at stake. Well, the incumbent forces aren't going to be as dumb as they were the last time, thinking they could just run the table. They're now going to get a lot more sophisticated, and they're not going to go after the open internet on a direct assault. They're going to do it with 1,000 little cuts. And that makes for different divide and conquer. There's different coalitions built around different kinds of bills, and we don't have the infrastructure to educate the internet public about what a small cut might mean, because it's just not well articulated, it's not well understood. So, maybe the Bill of Rights can act as a guide or a benchmark to measure, but we should expect, and I'm wondering how you think we should react or how the community should organize itself to protect 1,000 little cuts. I mean, on CISPA, Darrell, from my understanding is you're actually a supporter of CISPA to some degree.
I am, because ultimately one of the challenges we have is the NSA, all of our clandestine agencies, they're going to get a lot of information. The question is, are we going to make sure that we know the rules of the road? And a good example is the tools necessary to combat, whether it's China or some other country trying to take down our internet. We pay our intelligence agencies to have that. They're going to get it. They're going to get it from Microsoft. They're going to get it from Norton. They're going to get it from wherever it is. The question is there also a set of rules that they have to collaborate and give it back to industry? Are we in the private sector going to get any benefit from that protection, or is it one way only? My concern is there are some places in which you can't be an oak. You've got to be a bit of a willow. But if you have enough transparency, if you know exactly what the rules are and who's watching, then I think you can find a middle ground. That's a fairly limited, when you look at the Bill of Rights, you can't, you have free speech, but you can't yell fire here and have people run to the doors. My concern about CISPA is if we have no rules, and I was on the Intelligence Committee for a number of years, then the communication will be all one way. Those entities, either voluntarily or involuntarily, will still be sending the information, but it won't be transparent. That doesn't mean that I think the bill is perfect. I don't think we got it perfectly right. My committee only had part of it, the government to government. So we think we got that right, but that's not the part the public's concerned about. They're really concerned about when information is shared by, they call it voluntary, but when shared in a vast way by government, are we giving up our rights and our privacy? And the answer is, I don't know, but I want to make sure that there's transparency as to the process so that people know if it's happening and can object to it. Rob?
Andrew, you're right to say that CISPA is being perceived as different than PIPA and SOPA. I mean, for example, there are companies that were strongly opposed to PIPA and SOPA that are for CISPA. So what we have to do, and I gave the speech on the floor of the Senate on this issue, outlining some of the kind of key questions. If any of you are having trouble sleeping at night, you can go and see the speech. But the point, really is...
They're calling it up right as we speak.
Yeah. There's some fundamental, questions at stake. As I say, I am concerned that there are people who are using this cyber threat, which is a legitimate one, in effect to create, I call it a cyber-industrial, complex that really plays on people's fears and has a big appetite for private data. So what we have to do is step back and try to strike a balance between dealing with legitimate cyber threats and not use the cybersecurity legislation as a Trojan horse to basically sweep aside, piracy. And I've got about 5 or 6 specific provisions that I'm going to push for in terms of the CISPA bill. For example, I feel very strongly about ensuring that this legislation has a sunset provision. I don't want to put in place something, for all time. So I'm going to hold out strongly for that. I want to make sure that it is very narrowly targeted, so it doesn't, in effect, just be a blank, open-ended opportunity for government to gobble up people's, private data. So I've outlined those specific provisions, and that, in effect, almost takes you to what Darrell and I are talking about in terms of a digital Bill of Rights. If We had a digital Bill of Rights, and a proposed piece of legislation comes up with it. PIPA, SOPA, any one of these pieces of legislation. And frankly, I will tell you this morning as we speak, I'm as concerned about this big trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership proposal, unraveling some of their victories as anything out there. If we had something to measure all of these future proposals against, then we could get the word out to the community. What's striking about what's changed is Darrell and I, especially me, we're old enough to know that in the past, the way you got the word out was essentially through a phone tree. You had a community and somebody heard about a problem, you got on the phone, you called everybody. Well, what we're talking about is building a system with networks and the net roots that in effect creates a kind of signal all the way through the community. This means we got to mobilize and we've got to deal with the following 1, 2, 3 issues, and I think we can get there.
So Darrell, one of the problems in trying to analyze this situation is that it's not really just government controlling the internet or passing laws. It's the fact that the internet is actually controlled by multinational corporations that aren't accountable to anyone.
And Andrew, I think that's the thing that people have to know, is that you can look at 2 members of Congress and say, boy, if these guys are fighting for me and they can just get to 218 and get to 60, we're okay. And the answer is you're not, because the administration has come to us already and said, well, we've already agreed to certain things we're bound by. But of course, they didn't come for Senate confirmation. It's not a treaty as we know it. And yet they've already made deals that they're saying will have to be executed. Or at least they bar us from certain laws that would cause certain actions. So unelected people, whether they're corporate America or trade representatives or a working group, can in fact create problems. I think everyone here knows that the communication, assuming you're on your 802.11, that locally available here, without standards, we wouldn't have that. You can't just have pure chaos. You have to have people who come together who say, let's work together to find things that make things work better. The problem is these foreign, U.S. and foreign operations sometimes have an agenda, like the people behind SOPA and PIPA in the copyright business, who get into those and start, if you will, changing how a standard is created or what is acceptable. And that's the reason that we tell you, look, you can't just look at Washington. Ron and I have an obligation to make our government much more open and transparent, so you know when to disagree, you know what's coming, you know what's proposed legislation. But it's much harder to figure out what global groups, sometimes who don't even invite people that ultimately would have a different view, what they're proposing to do until it's very far down the road.
One of the reasons we wrote the alternative to PIPA and SOPA to look at this as a global commerce kind of issue and take it through the trade organizations was to deal with this multinational kind of threat to privacy, Andrew. But while we focus on the multinational component, one of the takeaways on this discussion about global commerce and the trade agreement is today the Motion Picture Association, the Recording Association, and Halliburton all have special rights to see the proposals that are being discussed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that this country's elected officials don't have and nobody in this audience has. And so we want to democratize this debate about this international challenge to internet freedom. And to give you an idea, one of my staffers is sitting out here. He's a staffer to the Trade Subcommittee. He can't see the documents that the lobbyists for the Motion Picture Association and Halliburton has to make sure these people get a fair shake. And we are going to stay at that, Congressman Issa and I, until we get that change, because this is a global challenge to internet freedom, and we need to mobilize citizens all around the globe.
Not one member of Congress is going to pay a penalty for supporting SOPA or PIPA. Not one member of Congress is going to pay a price for their sponsorship of that bill.
Well, I think that's probably half true. I don't see them being defeated, but part of the reason is that once the battle had moved, we had a lot of people who signed up who suddenly said, oh, I didn't know that was in there. And some of them were telling the truth. I'll give you just one example, Dan Lundgren. He had no idea what the denial of service, what the takedown was like in SOPA PIPA. And I watched it. I watched it during our actual, well, it was sort of our version of a filibuster where we kept offering amendments and amendments. Well, after a while, he started listening and he began realizing, well, wait a second, is this true? And of course, we had the facts. So how do you separate those from people who were simply doing the work of one side? And I think the answer is those who come back again with the same thing in a slightly different package, then you'll know who the true believers are. Because the people who signed on, who made it look like it was a done deal, those people aren't going to be on it again.
Let's just on a rough percentage basis. Let's assume that we've massaged the Digital Bill of Rights. We've got consensus in the community. We even have a cross-partisan cooperation.
We call it post-partisan in California.
Okay.
I guess some people have heard Arnold's statement.
So we've got something on a. If you were to submit it now, today, a iterated Bill of Rights, how many members of Congress do you think would sign it on a percentage basis?
I think we'll get a third that are willing to put their name on something, that they support this. Part of the whole point is it can't be Darrell's authorship. It's got to be.
I'm saying if it's crowdsourced and comes from the community, there's an internet coalition on the left and the right and the center that supports it, and then it was presented to members of Congress.
Andrew, if we got a chance through the organizations that are represented in this room to spend 6 months, in effect, going to the grassroots so that people felt empowered in the writing, and then we had another few months in order to make the case, I think we could come very close to having half of the Congress with us as we launch this. You have to understand, on the day that the Senate was going to vote to override my hold on PIPA, 41 United States senators were co-sponsors of PIPA. And that's like an army in the United States Senate. That's like running the tables. Almost all those senators had been told that sponsoring PIPA was low-hanging fruit. They were all told by the lobbyists, everybody's against piracy. Piracy is a terrible thing, and I know you heard from Ron, and God, he's from Oregon, and everybody knows what goes on in Oregon. And
I thought it stayed in Oregon.
Yeah, Ron's a nice guy, but this was the attitude until really January 18th, and 15 million emails, arrived, and messages and the like. And I don't think we should underestimate the power of that. But yes, this needs to be approached as a grassroots organizing campaign. And if we took 6 months to put this together and another few months to have people go and see their members of the House and Senate, I think Darrell and I could have close to half of the Congress.
If you think about not taxing the internet, for more than a decade, the Congress has resisted the urge to find new revenue for government off the internet. And that's because it was simple, it was understandable, and there was just an incredible community growing every day that objected to it. Now the question is, are we as concerned about maintaining our freedom? Can it be as simple, and can it have as many supporters? And if it does, we will get it into party platforms, we will get it onto the words of members of Congress, and most importantly, once it's a right, once it's established as a right, doesn't matter what the words are, then everything that Americans do, corporations,
and we're going to codify this in a law? Is that the goal?
The ultimate goal is to put these items into laws. A good example is the FCC needs to have a set of instructions that say these are the rights of people that the FCC has to observe when rulemaking, because more of your freedoms will be taken by regulatory agencies than Congress will ever take directly.
So with that said, I think it's fantastic that we see cooperation on this level. Most Americans don't get to see this. So I was going to suggest as the Netroots starts to rise up to support your call to action, that you do a road show. We'll crowdsource any city or county where they get 1,000 people to sign up to meet you guys. You guys are we'll go together.
Wherever 1,000 or more shall gather.
I'm in. Can I have 10 seconds? Folks, I've been in public service a while. I ran a legal aid office for senior citizens. I started when I had a full head of hair and rugged good looks, and And I can only tell you, working with all of you over this last decade, as we've tried to lay out a foundation for internet freedom, the question of the Communications Decency Act, the internet tax legislation Darrell spoke about, the digital signatures legislation, and finally PIPA and SOPA, this has been as satisfying a period as I can imagine in terms of public policy, because it's given us a chance to give citizens at a time when they're so frustrated about government the chance to take the reins of power back. That's why we're here today. That's what's going to make the next days and the months ahead a real treat. And thank you for having us.
Thank you.